This program, Western Civilization Framework for Freedom, was presented by Richard A. Matheson on February 23, 2020, to the Breakfast Forum of the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Lehigh Valley. Welcome to Western Civilization Framework for Freedom. And I call this Framework for Freedom, pardon the alliteration there, and my name is Richard Matheson, and this is my ninth presentation here. This is the forum. Okay, my subject today is really going to be three propositions. First one is Western civilization does exist because there's controversy. Second one, it's different from other modern civilizations, including Islamic or Chinese or even Eastern European, which I call Byzantine. And the third is there's a distinctive difference between Western civilization and the others, which is the high value placed on individual freedom and equality. So those are what I'm going to be trying to prove to you today. And they raise the question of where did Western civilization come from historically? So if you think of a timeline starting with the Big Bang or evolution, where in that process did evolution come from? And then the other one is, where are we headed in the future? Most of today is going to be about where did Western civilization come from? And why is Western civilization controversial? Courses in Western civilization were once a standard part of the college and university curriculum. Today, they're usually not required and even not offered, not even required for history majors. So there's been a big change in about 50 years in the colleges and universities. So, Part A, and this has 5 parts, and I'm going to be taking questions after each one. Where did Western civilization come from historically? There were 2 primary sources, and one of them was ancient Greece and Rome. In ancient Greece, we had the democracy, which is obviously a forerunner of our freedom, history, education, science, philosophy, art, architecture, citizenship in the ancient Greek polis, which was on an equality basis, voting, and then military might, which is always important whether we like it or not. And then ancient Rome, the Republic, the Empire, law, citizenship, and military might. So, in Greek history, we go back to Herodotus, considered the father of history. As you can see, well, actually there's Herodotus, the author of the Persian Wars, because way back in 450 or something like that BC, the Greek democracies fought against the Persian oligarchies, and that was a defining battle that began setting up this characteristic of Western civilization. And Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, teacher of Alexander the Great. And of course, Alexander the Great was the conqueror who spread Greek civilization throughout the Eastern world. By 332 BC, the king of Macedonia and Greece. And he had this vision of spreading Greek culture everywhere. And he actually accomplished a lot. And there was Caesar Augustus of the Romans. So Western civilization has a debt going back 2,400 years to Herodotus, the father of history. And I like to say Western civilization was marinated in the thought world of ancient Greece and Rome, if you don't mind the cooking metaphor. And it's also generally considered a secular heritage. So this is one of the 2 heritages of Western civilization. And Okay, now remember I said where did it come from? Historically, two primary sources. One was ancient Greece and Rome, and the other was Christianity. Because Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire until in 313. It was legalized by Constantine the Great, and in 391 became the official religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Theodosius. That's Constantine the Great, and legalized Christianity in 313. In 313, he legalized Christianity. In 330, he made a move that's very important for us. He split the Roman Empire into two halves. The eastern half was the Greek-speaking empire, known to history as the Byzantine Empire, and the western half was Latin-speaking, and that's what we call Western civilization. And in 391, Theodosius made Christianity the official religion. That's Theodosius. And here's a map of the split, and I want you to take a look at this because you can see the blue areas off to the right. No. There it is. There's Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire in the western half is headquartered at Rome. So that was the split that happened in 330, and this is actually a little bit later. So Christianity in the Roman Empire, Christianity had enormous influence for over 1,000 years. During that period, the Bible was regarded as literally true. We would today call that a fundamentalist viewpoint. And Western civilization, therefore, I say, was also marinated in a Christian thought world as well as a Greek thought world. And this heritage of Christianity is usually considered a religious heritage, but I'm not going to be dealing with anything religious. This is all about its secular impact. So, Christianity did have its own heritage of individual freedom and equality, which we will discuss. And Western civilization was therefore marinated for 2,400 years in the thought world of ancient Greece and Rome, secular culture, and marinated for over 1,500 years in the thought world of Christianity, a religious culture. And so how did our modern ideas of freedom and equality emerge from this combination of Greek and Roman ideas with the influence of Christianity? So we had Greek democracy, the Roman Republic, the English Magna Carta, the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the French rights of man. But, there's a big problem here, and it's called slavery. Because in the history of the world, there have been 3 great slave civilizations. And as you may know, both ancient Rome and ancient Greece. In fact, there's Greek slaves, and there's Roman slaves. And there's a third great slave civilization in the history of the world called the United States of America. And on July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was made official, all 13 colonies had legal slavery. This was not just the South. New York, in fact, didn't end slavery until 1827. So the United States was a slave civilization for its first 89 years. That's slaves in the South from a later period. So at the time of the Declaration of Independence, that's Philadelphia, we have George Washington, the father of his country, the victorious general, and the first president, and that's his home at Mount Vernon, which is a slave affair. and Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration of Independence. And there's his home in Monticello, again a slave plantation. And James Madison, the master designer of the Constitution. And there is Montpelier, his slavery plantation. And that's the Constitution. So in telling the story of Western civilization, we can't overlook these defects. The originators of the modern concepts of individual freedom and equality were far from perfect themselves. We can't tell a beautiful sounding story, we have to tell it accurately, warts and all. So let me stop and allow time for a few questions if you have any. I got you in the back.
Yeah, what about Egypt, where the Israelites were slaves and built the pyramids?
In Egypt, the Israelites.
Yeah, and that's one of the contributions of ancient Judaism and Christianity is the story of the Exodus, which is a story of freedom, and that plays an influential role here. And I'm going to be talking more about that, but thank you. Okay, let me move on here. And part B, we're going to go right to the 20th century, okay? And I'm going to talk about FDR and the Four Freedoms and Winston Churchill and the Iron Curtain. Franklin Delano Roosevelt on January 6, 1941, before the U.S. entered World War II, gave his speech called the Four Freedoms Speech. And he used that as justification. This would eventually become justification for the U.S. participation in World War II against Nazi Germany and Japan. And the four freedoms were political freedom, freedom from fear, economic freedom, freedom from want, religious freedom, and intellectual freedom. So when I talk about freedom generically, I am using Roosevelt's four freedoms as my basis, just so you know definitionally what I'm talking about. Okay, World War II ended September 2nd, that was the treaty. And World War III started 6 months later on March 5th when Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. World War III is the Cold War. And he was the Prime Minister in World War II. His speech in 1946 used the image of an Iron Curtain, and that marked the start of World War III, the Cold War between the United States and its allies, and then with the Soviet Union. This is a map of the Iron Curtain as described by Winston Churchill, and you can again see on the right side the Soviet Union in the red and the European democracies in the blue. And at this point, that war, the Cold War, lasted for 45 years, from 1946 to 1991, which is most of my lifetime. I was born in 1944. The Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear ICBMs aimed at the US. The US had thousands of nuclear ICBMs aimed at the Soviet Union. And World War III, that Cold War, was fought over the same four freedoms that had been enunciated by FDR. And the United States was regularly described as leading the, quote, free world in defending those four freedoms. So I'm just jumping, these are the four freedoms: political freedom, economic freedom, religious freedom, and intellectual freedom. And notice that the map of the free world as outlined by Winston Churchill looks almost identical to the map of the western half of the Roman Empire. There's the western and eastern division in the Roman Empire, and here is the Iron Curtain. It's a white line going down there. So I'll stop for questions again. Again, I'm just trying to show you that while we are looking at Western civilization historically, as recently as our own 20th century, major struggles took place that had this same division between the West and the East. Now, Part C, anthropology and freedom and individualism. So here we're going off in a very different direction again. Human nature, the view of science, this is the academic community about science, has changed rather radically in the last 20 years or so. Because the view 20 years ago was often called the blank slate, and this was described by, actually I have Steven Pinker here. There's Steven Pinker, his book, The Blank Slate, where human nature was viewed as something totally malleable, and each culture could decide for itself what it wanted to consider moral or immoral. And then by only 10 years later, in 2012, there was a whole bunch of science from the psychology and sociology that had done studies all over the world, and it showed something very different, that there are indeed consistencies in human nature across the whole world. And Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Minds, some of you have heard this many times. But all of this goes back to the hunter-gatherers, who were the original lifestyle of humans prior to agriculture. And hunter-gatherers lived in small bands of 25 to 50 persons without agriculture. All humans lived as hunter-gatherers for 500,000 years, almost 500,000 years. From 500,000 years ago up to 10,000 years ago when agriculture was invented. And agriculture came up about 8,000 BC. So the question is, what impact did this have? The hunter-gatherers were egalitarian, and this is what somebody was talking about. They lived, like the Iroquois or the others, they lived in a very egalitarian lifestyle. They would not allow any person to become dominant. They were just insistent on this. And it was perplexing to the first anthropologists who studied them. They would go in and say, you know, who's your leader? And they would go like, well, not me, not me. And this person who studied this and made sense, his name is Christopher Bohm, Hierarchy in the Forest, 1999. But he was able to show that this hunter-gatherer egalitarianism required constant attention, because what the hunter-gatherers found was they were always under threat from men, and it was always men, who wanted to become bullies and push other people around, and they developed a very strong line of defense to keep the dominant alpha types, and they had to be internally vigilant. And in fact, Bohm concluded that what the hunter-gatherers actually did was had what he called a reverse dominance hierarchy. Now, throughout the animal world, I think I have this, throughout the animal world, you see most animals there, there is an alpha, often an alpha male, but sometimes an alpha female, and that's the boss of a group. And that's true in our closest ancestors of chimpanzees or gorillas. But the ancient hunter-gatherers, Bohm said, had a reverse dominance hierarchy where the group kept the alphas under control, and they would, if necessary, assassinate them if somebody got too big for their britches. So this, well, it was a problem, and I think, well, so what does it mean that humans lived for 490,000 years of the last 500,000 years, that's 98% of human existence, in these small egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups? We had to depend on each other. There was no outside protection. So we are wired to be egalitarian, to strongly avoid being dominated by any other person. It's our DNA, and we're wired to love freedom, but agriculture changed that dramatically. So what's evolutionary morality? Well, scientists, particularly Jonathan Haidt, have looked at all these studies across the world to find out the commonalities of morality around the world, and that's what we would call evolutionary morality. This is Jonathan Haidt. And I'm going to skip the triune brain. I've done this a couple of times for you. The elephant and the rider, basically what scientists found was that most moral decisions are made in that amygdala, the emotional brain, rather than in the rational brain, which is why we have so much trouble when we get into arguments. But he described it as the elephant and the rider, where the rider is the rational brain, but the elephant is the emotional brain. And the elephant basically makes the decisions, and then the rational brain is good at explaining them. We can rationalize almost anything, right? But the decisions are being made in our emotions, and what Jonathan Haidt wanted to do was understand what was driving the emotions. And here was the result of these worldwide studies by him and many other people. He wasn't the only one, but this was a development really in the last 20 years. There were 6 moral foundations, and you see on the left column, care, harm, caring for the people in the small group, right, of the hunter-gatherer group. Fairness or cheating, making sure everybody is equal. Liberty, oppression, don't allow dominance. Loyalty, betrayal, you must be loyal to the group or else. Authority versus subversion, there's always authority. And sanctity, something is always sanctified, whatever it may be. These can be used in many different ways across the country if you know anything about the vast differences between different groups of hunter-gatherers. But he also found, and these scientists found, that there was a big difference in the countries that are defined as Western. Because the Western morality of these 6 is very focused on the left-hand column. And cross-cultural morality across the whole world is focused on all 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the scientists who began studying this kept noticing that Western countries had a different profile of how they paid attention to these 6 moral issues. Across the world, people treated them all about the same. Western nations tended to focus on the left 3, and it led to this conclusion that Western moralities was weird. But that doesn't mean they're bad. It means Western countries that were Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic had one profile that was different from the rest of the human race, so to speak. And that that Western morality, the left-hand column you see, is very individualistic, and it's focused on caring for people, fairness, and liberty, freedom. Whereas cross-culturally, societies are focused on all 6, and that often means, I'm just trying to, oh, maybe I took that out. But when you get to things like loyalty, that's patriotism. You know, patriotism is very important, authority is important, religion, but in the Western societies, just more emphasis on individualism. And his surveys are all modern, not hunter-gatherers, but presumably all human nature, all the things we have in common, came out of that long 490,000 years of hunter-gatherer life. That's what formed our DNA. So, when the hunter-gatherer lifestyle for those 490,000 years is replaced by agriculture, then the egalitarianism collapses, okay? Because then we have chiefs and kings and emperors. And the task today in our agricultural societies is how to control bullies, the dominant alphas. And that was done by historically Greek democracy, English Magna Carta, the American Constitution, how do you control a leader with laws? And that idea of controlling bullies, dominant alphas, was a battle that was won in hunter-gatherer society. They could control it. It was lost with agriculture, and now we're basically trying to win it again, and that's what freedom is about. So let me stop for questions again. Okay, let me get going here. If I can. Okay, what did Christianity contribute to these concepts of individual freedom and equality and the Exodus narrative of freedom, the separation of church and state, and the equality of all souls before God? And the Exodus narrative is a foundational story of Judaism and Christianity, a story of freedom, describes a higher power demanding Moses at the burning bush to lead the higher power's chosen people out of slavery in Egypt to a promised land. And that became a very powerful story, not only for the Jewish people, but for Christians, because they adopted the whole Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, called it the Old Testament. And that story was foundational. That's the Exodus. This is a modern celebration of Passover, because every Passover, if you ever attended a Seder, is the retelling of the story of the freeing of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, the plagues, the going through the Red Sea. Reading the story of the Exodus. Separation of church and state. When Christianity and the Roman Empire came together, that was 391 when it became officially Christian. Augustine, Saint Augustine, brought Greek thought and Christian thought together in a book called The City of God, where he described the state, which was the Roman state, as composed of two cities, the city of God and the city of humans. And the city of God had these high ideals, and the city of human had all of these ugly things that had to be done, fighting off barbarians and things like that. But that idea of conceptual separation of church and state, that's Augustine of Hippo. He wrote that book in 426 AD. And let me stop for questions. Frank?
Yeah, one thing I find difficult to accept is Christianity as being linked with separation of church and state. Throughout the history of Christianity up till the present time, Christianity has always assumed that everyone should be Christian, that the state should be Christian, that the secular state should not exist. And so that's, I think...
You're right, it was a conceptual separation, that the state has its sphere and the church has its sphere, Well,
that's what I'm arguing, that the church should be dominant over the secular sphere, and that the church rules should always apply in the secular state. There's no such thing as strictly secular rules.
I would say that Augustine separated the concepts, and then later thinkers, particularly in the Protestant Reformation, really broke it apart and set up that separation. That's much later, you're right.
I didn't follow how that relates to freedom.
How that
relates, the basic idea that you had to believe such and such had to be overcome.
I mean, nobody's going to say that the Israelites were free people by any means. Just like nobody's going to say that the Greeks or all of these societies had many big problems, including the Israelites. What you do have as the foundational story of Israel is this Exodus, which is a flight or a journey from slavery to freedom. And actually this is what I'm going to be dealing with a month from now. But that's that narrative was always there. I mean, I can tell you one of the places this whole exodus was a major focus was in the civil rights movement in the United States. You know, the African Americans were very familiar with the story of the exodus from Egypt and Moses, and you know, in their view, that was their own journey that they bought into. So I'm not trying to say that the Israelites were free by any means, you know. They were as messed up as all agricultural peoples are. But okay, are we ready? Okay. Because this is really my final section, and this is about the divergent histories of East and West. Remember, the Emperor Constantine split the Roman Empire into the East and West. The two parts, the Byzantine and the East, and the Western sit on the West. And I'm going to try to cover 1,600 years of history in 10 minutes. Fortunately, the main events are well known, but after 391, that's when Christianity became legal. The eastern, western, and western halves of the Roman Empire have very different histories, because the east half, the Byzantine half, remained unified for the next 1,000 years, and it's known as the Byzantine Empire. It was finally conquered by the Muslims in 1458. But that was 1,000 years in the east, but it was 1,000 years of top-down rule. It was not broken into different countries. It was the emperor in Constantinople, running that show in the east. And here I have, okay. Remained unified for 1,000 years, but it was top-down. It was not conducive to the development of freedom. It produced a lot of great things. This is Byzantine art, and there's the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Byzantine architecture was great. That's from 537 AD. The western half of the Roman Empire had a very different experience. And I'm going to break this down into three categories: 400 to 1,000, we call the Dark Ages; 1,000 to 1,600, the High Middle Ages; and 1,600 to 1,800, the Wars of Religion and the two Enlightenments, the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. And I'm going to be following Thomas Kuhn here. He wrote a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he's a historian of science. But Kuhn said in that book, he says the medieval church from 1000 to 1600, that middle period, the High Middle Ages, was very supportive of science. But if you go back before 1000, the Dark Ages, the church was very negative on science. And then after 1600, the church switched and became negative again. So we're going to look at each of those three periods separately, starting with the Dark Ages of 400 to 1000. This was the period when the Western Roman Empire was overrun by barbarians, right? First, the Germanic tribes, the barbarians. And you can see this picture. And the sack of Rome in 410 AD by the Visigoths. The fall of Rome in 476. And during the Dark Age, the western half of the Roman Empire disintegrated into feudalism. The Germanic barbarians were gradually converted to Christianity, and then the West faced a second set of barbarians, which were the Vikings, attacking from primarily Norway and Denmark into England and Ireland, and the areas like Normandy. But eventually the Vikings were converted to Christianity. So this whole period of 600 years, 400 to 1,000, was not necessarily a period of progress. There was a lot of progress, but it was one where everybody was fighting among themselves. You had Charlemagne in 800 being crowned, as the king of the Holy Roman Empire. The only unifying factor in this period was the church, the Roman Catholic Church. Well, there's the Vikings. Okay, then we get to the High Middle Ages. They're much more positive, but the political structure by this time was fractured into competing nations, right? France, Germany, Britain, Norway, Sweden, Italy. The only unifying factor was the church, and the church was very supportive of science. In fact, in the High Middle Ages, there's enormous progress in science and art, the founding of the great universities. And that led to the Renaissance and the Reformation. Here is, I found this the earliest universities are in this period. The first one was the University of Bologna in 1088, 1096 Oxford in England, 1134 Salamanca in Spain, 1150 Paris in France. Although Paris is not considered one of the oldest universities because it was shut down by the French Revolution and then it was not continuous. Cambridge in England in 1209, Padua in Italy 1222, Naples in Italy, Siena in Italy, Coimbra in Portugal, Valladolid in Spain, Rome in 1303. These are all from this period of the High Middle Ages, and the university is really, according to the sources I read, is a European creation. And creation by the church, basically, for training its pastors and monks. There's Thomas Aquinas, who recovered Plato and Aristotle. The interesting thing, all of these Greeks were recovered by Europe during this period of the High Middle Ages, but much of it came from the Muslim countries, especially in Spain, because there was a huge Spanish Renaissance at the same time.
I'm just curious how many of those are still out there?
All of them.
All of
That's
them?
the top 10 oldest universities that are
Oh,
still. And when I got to Paris, I had to say it's not considered continuous because it was shut down and then reopened.
Okay, all right. I wasn't
Yeah, that's the
paying
top
attention.
10 oldest, according to Google, according to Wikipedia.
Okay, thank you.
So, the Catholic Church in the middle with the great cathedrals are from this time, Gothic architecture. And then we get in 1600 to the wars of religion and the two enlightenments. The big war was the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, when approximately 25% of the population of Europe was killed in battles between Protestants and Catholics. But it also gave a strong boost to freedom, often inadvertently. And it led to two enlightenments, the Scottish and the French Enlightenment. And the connection of freedom and power, and an author named David Gress explained, this is his opening 2 sentences of his book called From Plato to NATO. Quote, liberty grew because it served the interests of power. This apparent paradox was the core of Western identity. Liberty grew because it served the interests of power. This really has me thinking. Here is the book From Plato to NATO. And it was a highly competitive international situation in the West, right? England and France and Italy and all these countries are at each other's throat constantly. And in this situation, the nation with the most freedom gained I call it an accidental advantage, an unintentional advantage. That nation happened to be England, and after union with Scotland in 1707, it was called Great Britain. And the Scottish Enlightenment is a fascinating time. It's received a lot of attention from scholars because they're realizing that it used to be the Enlightenment was considered French, which it was, But the French and the Scottish Enlightenments were very different. The most famous figure of the Scottish Enlightenment is Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations about free market economics. But there were many others, especially in the field of moral philosophy, David Hume in philosophy, and Francis Hutchinson. And the one big difference was the Scottish Enlightenment was not anti-church, because the Scots were Presbyterians uniting with the English, who were Anglicans. And of course, these were at each other's throats through most of the period, but they always united against the Roman Catholics, right, in Ireland. Well, this gets all very complicated, but the Scottish Enlightenment was not anti-church. The French Enlightenment was very definitely anti-church because they had to fight against the Catholic Church in France. The impact in the United States. The Scottish Enlightenment had a huge impact. And part of this goes back even to James Madison, studied with Witherspoon, who grew up in Scotland. And there was a huge impact both in terms of ideas and the huge influx of Scots and Scots-Irish who emigrated to America. And this is the book, How the Scots Invented the Modern World by Arthur Herman, which very readable. Okay, between 1600 and 1800, we have the English Glorious Revolution, 1688, the American Revolutionary War, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, 1786, the American Constitution, the American Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Right. All of these things, what we think of as the modern source of freedom, came out of this one era of the following the Renaissance, Reformation, and then the Enlightenment. Let me pause again for questions. I have one more slide here. Finally, we can discuss the future of freedom and equality in Western civilization. One significant question is the teaching about Western civilization, both at high school and at the college level, because we've gone from having that as a standard part of education 50 years ago to where it's almost non-existent. And that's partly because there's been an attack on Western civilization that started in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War. The Western civilization was bad because we were attacking the Vietnamese. And it led to the removal, and then sometimes it was reinstated and then removed again. There's a famous protest, this is Jesse Jackson in 1987, leading a protest of 500 students against a Western civilization course, and they're chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go." And the question is, the argument is made, well, we're in a multicultural world, we need to learn all history, not just Western. Well, my argument is, well, first of all, we need to know our own history, because Western civilization exists. That's what I've been at least trying to show you. It's different from the other modern civilizations, and it is, the difference is this concept of freedom and equality. If you want to try to do research in an Islamic university about the Prophet Muhammad and what was wrong with him, good luck. Or in Russian university about Putin, or a Chinese university about President Xi. Freedom is a precious thing.
How about Trump?
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.